Hello. Today we're going to be talking about something that I've brought up many times in multiple different videos, including the Amber Heard video. Homelessness and domestic abuse, and how men are the ones primarily affected. Although nobody can ever talk about it, because if you say anything that shows support for men, aka the truth, or something that does not praise women, you are automatically shadow banned, blocked, and insulted. But I'm Matt's FTR, so I don't care. Now, you might be wondering why I'm talking about this particular story, because it happened back in 2013. Well, actually, the story being old is one of the reasons why I'm talking about it. Now, granted, I only learned about this recently by Chloe Roma. You guys may know that I made a video on her like almost a year ago where she kind of like nuked her community and I was criticizing her for it. And she deserved criticism for that, by the way. But this is one of her really good videos, so it's important to also. A lot of people don't think of the world this way, but it's important to always, compliment somebody for what they do good and criticize them when they do something wrong. So I can criticize Chloe, but still support her at the same time. For anybody wondering. Anyway, point is, as I said, part of the reason why I'm talking about this is because it's an old story. It being an old story shows all of us just how ignored men's issues are. Now, that's not shocking. Most people with even a shred of knowledge on the real world knows that men's issues are ignored. But this is a great story that actually emphasizes and highlights that. This happened almost 10 years ago, and the video of the man's family talking has only about 3,000 views. That is disgusting. Now, we all know, although many people won't admit to it, we all know that if this story was about a woman, it would have millions of views and it would make the news. But because it's a man, as always, it gets ignored. This is the story about a man named Earl Silverman. A fellow Canadian campaigner, Jeremy Swanson of Father's Can in Ottawa, paid the following tribute. Gruff, difficult in personality, and hard to understand he might have been, but he was something else too. He was a real man. He was a compassionate one and a determined activist who was always on the go. Always planning, always leading, always prodding. Earl made hard work seem easy. He believed absolutely in what he was doing, and while some might call him obsessed with the mission, I prefer to call him determined. Feminists and people who don't understand real issues would call him obsessive, but again, just like the article said, if you have any comprehension of the real world and not what the mainstream media pushes and stuff like that, you would understand. According to news reports, Silverman was a victim of domestic abuse at the hands of his former wife and struggled to access help, like all men. When I went into the community looking for some support services, I couldn't find any. There were a lot for women. Yes, little fact for those of you who just don't know, most homeless shelters or abuse shelters are for women, despite the fact that most victims are men. A few statistics if you simply don't know. Domestic abuse is actually almost exactly 50-50 between men and women. However, there are two main factors that are always ignored that prove that it's actually worse for men. Number one, the stats show almost a 50-50 exact, but abused women are actually overreported because there are many women who will claim abuse and be flat out lying about it, or will claim abuse on a situation that's not actually abuse. For example, the amount of women who claim that they were abused because they got into a vocal argument. These kind of things happen all the time, and there's high numbers in that too. Additionally, abused men are heavily underreported. The reason for this is because men have simply been taught their whole lives to man up, be a man, don't show tears, be tough, don't complain. If you claim that a woman abuses you, it's because you're weak and pathetic and all that stuff. Men are heavily ignored even when they are victims and even when they do speak. So a lot of men in our society choose to just stay quiet, say nothing, because they don't want to be laughed at for making a claim. On top of that, there are several instances of abuse cases going to court and the woman winning just for being a woman, or the man claiming, having claimed that he's lying because he's a man and there's no way he could possibly be abused. So you got the men who actually try to make a court case but lose because they're men, or don't do it at all because they're afraid of being shamed, etc. So yes, abuse on men is heavily underreported. That was a two-part fact. And the second fact is that even though, again, we're close to 50-50, supposedly, women initiate 70% of all domestic abuse. It doesn't mean that 70% of cases are women abusing the man. It just means that they initiate the actual domestic argument. They initiate it. So these are factors that are always ignored, but they're important and they're true. There were a lot for women, and the only programs for men were for anger management. Of course. And again, here's another factor that shows that this is also backwards. They claim, well, if a man's abused, it's only because you're angry and it's probably your fault. It's the same mentality we see of like, well, if a man cheats, it's because he's scum. If a woman cheats, it's because the man was scum and pushed her towards it. The double standard of men always being blamed for everything no matter what applies here like it does to pretty much everything else. So it's the same thing with anger management. However, if we check the stats, you would see that the highest stat for abuse is actually in lesbian relationships, aka women, because women are just, in general, much more violent than men are. But again, people are very afraid to actually admit these statistics. He said recently, as a victim, I was re-victimized by having these services telling me that I wasn't a victim, but I was a perpetrator. And that is one of the many reasons why men also make up the majority on suicide. 80% of all suicides are men. I have a fantastic video on suicide. I strongly suggest you check it out. Point is, though, there are many reasons that drive men to suicide and why 80% of all suicides are men and only 20% are women, but this is one of many reasons. 3 years ago, Silverman set out to help other men in his position by turning his own home in Calgary into the men's alternative safe house, MASH. Around 20 men, some with children, used the service before it closed last month. Silverman, who self-funded the venture, was unable to keep up with the bills and closed the shelter and sold his home last month. He was found hanging in the garage by the new owner, Stephen Howitt, who told the National Post, "I couldn't have predicted this. The sad thing is you literally could have. If society cared about facts, even a tiny little bit, you could easily predict this. A man who was abused, no one cared. A man who created his own shelter to help other men, no one cared. He couldn't keep up with the costs because no one cared and the government didn't want to fund it. He had to close it down, killing his self-esteem or his dream, as well as the men he was trying to help. As a result of not receiving any help and couldn't help himself, he committed suicide. All of that actually makes perfect sense, if you understand facts. But unfortunately, these are facts that society hides because women. I got the sense that he was pretty frustrated, obviously, that the shelter didn't work out. He was frustrated with the government that he didn't get any help. But if it was a woman, there would have been tons of help. Silverman was known to many leading acolytes in the men's rights movement around the world, and many of them paid tribute to him this weekend. In his lifetime, Silverman tried many different approaches to try and win greater support for male victims of domestic violence. Behind all of those efforts was a straightforward logic, epitomized by this comment to the press in 2011. All I know is that there are male victims of domestic violence. There are not the same support services available to men as there are for women, even though we literally need them more. We have explored the needs of women for such a long time, at the expense of ignoring men. At what point do we say we can put that on hold and start looking at men now, or looking at both equally? As a former victim himself, Earl believed it was essential to provide men with more opportunities to reach out for help. Men are not really provided with an option of asking for help, he said. Number one, men are not victims. Victim is sort of reserved for women. I want men to be recognized. Feel free to continue reading this entire article if you wish, but I want to move on. This is a video, I believe, of his family talking about his death. And again, only 3K views in 7 years. You know how much it would have if it was a woman.
Hi everyone, I'm Phil from Cafe Vancouver, and this is
Jesse,
Enya,
Gigi, and we're from SFU AMB.
We're gathered here today to remember Earl Silverman.
Earl was a longtime men's rights advocate and founded the Calgary Men's Alternative Safe House in 2010, believed to be the only men's domestic violence shelter in Canada at that time.
By all reports, Earl gave everything he had to keep the safe house open and raise awareness of the fact that women and men are victims of domestic violence at virtually equal numbers, yet victim resources are made available almost exclusively to women.
Tragically, neither the media nor the Canadian government paid attention.
After 3 years of running the safe house out of his own home and denied funding multiple times, Earl was forced to sell his home and close the safe house.
Earl himself had been a victim of domestic violence.
Quote, When I went into the community looking for some support services, I couldn't find any. There were a lot for women, and the only programs for men were for anger management. As a victim, I was re-victimized by having these services telling me that I wasn't a victim, but I was a perpetrator.
Shortly after Earl was forced to close the safe house, in the early morning hours of April 26, 2013, he penned a 3-page letter to his friends and loved ones and then hung himself.
In his final years, Earl devoted his life to working for fairness and justice for men and their families.
In his letter, he wrote that he hoped a review of his death would help create services for men.
In 2014, CAFE launched the first Canadian Centre for Men and Families that offers shelter for male victims in the Toronto area. It remains open to this day.
None of us ever met Earl, but all of us here today fighting for issues affecting men and boys know we're standing on the shoulders of brave men like Earl who would not stay quiet.
Earl Silverman, you will not be forgotten, and
We will not stay quiet.
Please share this video with the hashtag #RememberEarl.
Unfortunately, this never got many views at all. Anyway, rest in peace, Earl Silverman. Thank you for being one of the men out there to actually care about other men and true equality. So we've talked about domestic abuse. We've talked about violence and shelters for abuse. Now let's talk about homelessness and how that also affects men more than women. This is a great video by Dr. Shame. Instead of just telling you guys straight up this and that, I'm just going to show you the video. He shows some incredible facts that are very well stated and constructed, better than I could do, with sources and everything. I think a lot of people also don't know about this, so have a watch. Again, credit goes to Dr. Shame on YouTube.
As of 2001, 2/3 of the homeless population in the United States consisted of men unaccompanied by children, and 84% of them are single adults between the ages of 25 and 54. Despite the fact that 41% of homeless men have jobs versus only 27% of homeless women, homeless men are substantially less likely to have health insurance. Where 62% of homeless men are lacking health insurance, only 40% of homeless women are uninsured. Homeless men are also less likely to be on government assistance. Only 22% of homeless men have Medicaid, versus 47% of homeless women, and only 38% of homeless men receive government benefits, versus 60% of homeless women. But that study was conducted in 2001. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, as of 2007, unmarried men account for 76% of the homeless population. The same report says 40% of homeless men are veterans, even though only 34% of the general population has served in the armed forces. This means that, statistically, people who have served in the military are more likely to become homeless, and since men account for 84% of those serving in the military, this obviously means men are more affected. According to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, that figure has gone down in recent years, but veterans are still overrepresented among the homeless. According to them, 91% of homeless veterans are men. Because veterans are likely to suffer from traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, or other mental illnesses, and drug dependency, many of them become unemployable once they leave the service. According to Pew Research Center, women are about twice as likely to be on food stamps than men are. This could be a symptom of women having lower average income than men, and thus needing them more, or it could be because the requirements for SNAP benefits are more lenient if you have children. And, as has already been established, homeless men are far less likely to be accompanied by children. In fact, those without children can't even qualify for temporary assistance for families and can only get SNAP benefits for 3 months out of every 3 years unless they're working at least part-time, which may not even be possible for homeless men suffering from disabilities or mental illness, which is the case with most homeless veterans. So if you're a single homeless man, you simply have fewer options than a homeless woman with kids. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, women of all age groups are more likely to receive public assistance. An article on Journalist Resource points out that more women than men are on food stamps, and like many other articles I've seen, their tone is that it's so terrible that so many women are dependent on these welfare systems. But all of them ignore the fact that men aren't receiving these benefits as much as women, despite the fact that men make up the majority of the homeless population. And this suggests to me that there are more men in need of these welfare systems, but are being denied access to them. There's also a general assumption that any man who ends up homeless somehow deserves to be. Peter Marin of the Alicia Peterson Foundation summarizes the situation rather succinctly in his article, Abandoning Men, Jill Gets Welfare, Jack Becomes Homeless. To put it simply, men are neither supposed to nor allowed to be dependent. They are expected to take care of others and themselves, and when they cannot or will not do it, then the assumption at the heart of the culture is that they are somehow less than men and therefore unworthy of help. An irony asserts itself. By being in need of help, men forfeit the right to it. This isn't just a problem in the United States. In the United Kingdom, 71% of the homeless population is male, and those homeless men are also substantially more likely to be addicted to drugs and to suffer from mental health problems than homeless women. Despite this, the issues surrounding male homelessness get little to no public attention. And to make matters worse, charities and advocacy groups which claim to be fighting homelessness don't seem interested in talking about how homelessness uniquely affects men, only when it affects women. Why is it that even charities and advocacy groups have less sympathy for male victims? That's a subject for another time.
So there you have it. Those are most of the facts about homelessness and how it mostly affects men. And a lot of people simply don't know that. It's disgusting what we see in our modern day, especially the last 10 or so years. Anyway, if you don't know much about homelessness and domestic abuse, I really hope that this video helped teach you something, that men are the ones who are truly suffering in our modern world. For the record.